I never thought I'd write one of these. I always read them late at night with popcorn, feeling like a voyeur in other people's messy lives. Tonight my hands are shaking as I type because I need to put this somewhere outside my own head. I need to hear myself say it out loud, or at least in writing. My wife cheated on me. I prepared for a divorce. I made sure she got nothing. And then something impossible happened that nobody could have predicted. If this reads like cold-blooded revenge, believe me when I say I felt anything but cold. But also, if you ask whether I regret how carefully I planned things, I don't know how to answer that anymore. A little background. I'm 38M, she's 34F. We were together for 10 years and married for 5. We live in a house that looks like it belongs on a lifestyle Instagram, and we have a car that turned heads in our neighborhood. For most of our relationship, I thought I'd found my person. I worked a stable middle management job, she freelanced part-time and did the domestic juggling we seemed to need. We had a rhythm, if not flawless, then believable. I thought that was enough. 2 years ago, my mother retired and moved closer to me. She'd been a single parent for most of my life, and she never trusted banks or lawyers for big-ticket things. So when I bought the house, I did it in her name. When I leased the car, I did it in her name. I know how that sounds, evasive or paranoid, but at the time it felt like the most practical thing. My mother had credit, and tucking big assets into her name made loan approvals easier and cheaper. It also meant putting a thick, unusual legal buffer between our marital assets and the lenders. I told my wife that it was temporary, paperwork to be cleaned up later. She laughed it off. She trusted me. She still does to some degree, which is part of why this hurts so sharply. I first suspected something was off 4 months ago. Nothing cinematic, no lipstick on collars, no mysterious receipts. Just tiny, precise edits to our life. She started leaving earlier than usual to work coffee meetings, and coming back smelling faintly different, as if she'd been somewhere with rain and citrus. Her phone, always on the kitchen counter, began to migrate into coat pockets and purse depths. She was distracted in ways that are hard to name. Quieter when she got home, more careful with her words, protective of small gestures. People throw the word cheater around a lot on these subreddits, and half the time the evidence is thin. I wanted to be fair. I asked her if everything was okay. She smiled and said yes. I wanted to believe it. Then one night I saw a message that changed everything. I was doing dishes, a domestic thing we've always shared, and her new habit of moving her phone to the bedroom meant I had a clear path to the kitchen counter where she'd left it charging. It's petty and human, but the sight of the glow on the bedside table pulled me like gravity. I told myself I'd only glance at the wallpaper. Of course, I opened it. The lock screen was on, and the phone buzzed. A message preview popped up. Can't wait. Tonight. My stomach tightened so hard I thought it might cramp. I put the dishes in the drying rack, hands wet, and walked down the hallway. I know this is the point where people say, you should have confronted them, and for a second I almost did. But I'd learned something over the years. Confrontation in the heat of an emotion rarely produces truth. It produces confusion, excuses, tears, something to stop the pain in the moment. I wanted evidence. I wanted the truth in a way that couldn't be gaslit away as misunderstanding. So I waited. For 2 nights, I followed the pattern, keeping quiet at home while she left for meetings. I tracked timestamps, I noted the times she left and returned, and I learned the rhythm of her deception. I learned the names she used in texts, Tom and Mateo, but a name is only a clue. The person she was meeting was an absence I couldn't fill with assumptions. I needed to know who he was and whether there had been a betrayal at a scale that would break us. On the 3rd night, I installed a cheap tracking app on her phone. Moral lines blur when you're trying to protect something you think is sacred. You tell yourself you're being a necessary monster. Once the app painted a map of late-night movements to a small, generic hotel downtown, everything else snapped into focus. She wasn't having lunch with colleagues. She was sneaking into rooms with someone else. I booked a cheap motel down the road from that hotel and sat there 2 nights later, heart a gray murmuring animal that would not be calmed. I watched the hotel's front door with the sort of attention that eats your insides. At 11:17 p.m., she walked out holding a cup like she'd been to a late-night coffee shop, hair under a cap, eyes tired. A man stepped out of the shadows, put an arm around her, and kissed her as if the world had been waiting for that exact scene to open. He looked at me, my vantage allowed me to see his face, and he was handsome in a deliberately casual cinematic way. I watched as if I were watching someone else spiral. The thing is, watching is powerless. I wanted to run to her and scream, to ask why, to beg for an explanation that would stitch something back together. But revenge, as it turns out, is patient. The night's images burned into my skull. They were the reason I slept with a plan forming like a statue being chiseled slowly. Divorce is messy. Most people here on Reddit know that. It's full of paperwork and lawyers and the creeping erasure of a shared life. I could have pressed charges for infidelity. In my state, adultery is not a crime, but it's a slash in the moral ledger. Yet the real war is civil, not criminal. I wanted to walk out with the truth for myself and leave her with the knowledge of what she'd lost. But more than that, when you feel betrayed, you also want safety. The cheapest route to emotional safety is the legal kind: money, house, car, security. My early, seemingly pragmatic decision to put the house and car in my mother's name suddenly looked like premonition more than pragmatism. I hired a lawyer quietly the next week. Not the glitzy sort with TV commercials and promises of scorched earth divorces. I found a calm, precise woman named Olivia who smelled faintly of coffee and legal pads. I told her the basics. We were married, we had no children together. I had assets nominally under my mother's name, and I suspected infidelity. You have to prove it, she said, not unkindly. And you have to keep this discreet. The last thing you want is a public fight in which you look like the villain. She was right, so I prepared. Not in the way people think of preparation, not with angry letters or leaked photos, but with cold, considered checks and balances. I collected proof: hotel logs, receipts, dates corroborated by surveillance footage I legally obtained from the hotel's public entrance. They couldn't deny I was there as a customer. I documented patterns: timestamps from her messages, bank statements that showed late-night charges. I saved everything in an encrypted folder, because nothing kills a case like sloppy evidence. I also did the pragmatic things people rarely want to talk about. I moved bank accounts I controlled into different institutions that were purely mine. I consolidated savings that had been joint into accounts my mother set up as custodial for me. I spoke to my mother honestly, without theatrics, about the possibility of divorce. She didn't like hearing it, but she had been through stuck marriages herself and had a practical streak that sometimes mistook toughness for tenderness. When I told her we'd be formalizing the house in her name permanently, she asked precisely 2 questions. Do you want my name on it forever? And do you have a plan for after? I told her yes and said nothing about the emotional toll. She is not someone I tell everything to. I tell her what matters. While I guarded our finances, I also changed myself. People who betray others often think the betrayed will crumble with rage. Maybe that's true for some. For me, it mattered to be steady. I cut back on the small displays of pain that might give her a weapon in court. No public arguments, no accusatory social media posts, no leaving voicemails that sounded like a man on fire. That hurt in its own way. It felt like holding water in my palms until it almost evaporated. But stabilizing my behavior made my eventual actions cleaner. And in the theater of divorce, cleanliness matters. When I finally confronted her, I did it in a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and lemon. I placed all the evidence on the counter the way a surgeon lays out instruments. I told her I knew. I said nothing more than the truth. She blinked, and for the first time in months I saw the old woman behind her, the frightened girl who had once taken jobs she hated to keep a steady salary. Her voice wavered. She didn't deny much because denial would have required imagination beyond her capacity for self-preservation. She apologized. She cried. She begged. I felt my old love for her shrink and curl like a moth in a jar. I could have thrown a tantrum. I could have torn the house apart, made accusations in front of friends, called her family. Instead, I handed her a printout, a settlement proposal I had my lawyer draft. It was not generous. That's not flattering to say, but it's true. The property we'd been living in would remain in my mother's name, the car would stay registered to my mother, and she would be offered a modest cash settlement that would buy her a few months of independence. In our state, because the house and car had never been legally in our names jointly, they weren't automatically marital property. That's the legal reality, not a moral one. People will read that and call me cold. They will say marriage is a partnership and that you protect your partner through everything. They will say no one should hide assets or make decisions that leave a spouse destitute. They might be right, but let me explain what it felt like from my side. I had watched her be dishonest in the most intimate way and been lied to for months. I had prepared for a life with her and then felt like a stranger whose trust had been used for someone else's thrill. The house, the one we shared, carried every memory in the wood grain. I couldn't stomach the idea of her having an automatic claim to it when she'd used me as a safety net. The house wasn't a bank account in the abstract. It was where I had slept next to her, where I had buried my head into her hair and made plans for holidays, and where I had boxed up my mother's old plates. If she chose someone else while pretending to choose me, then the moral calculus in my chest changed. So I signed the papers. She cried and called me every name in the book. Her friends said I was cruel, and maybe I was. The lawyer's office was polite, efficient, and devoid of moral drama. We arranged the handover of keys. She moved out with a duffel bag the size of a small dog and a manufactured smile. People on our block made sympathetic faces. They were decent neighbors who didn't want to pick sides. I gave her what the law said she was owed, no more, no less. Was that petty? Probably. Was it legally clean and airtight? Absolutely. That was the point. The weeks after the divorce were strange. In public, I pieced myself together like a man learning to walk again. I went to work, filed transfer papers, and reclaimed small parts of myself that had been swallowed by a shared life. The corner spot at the coffee shop, the music I listened to alone, the weekend routines that now felt like reclaimed territory. But at night my chest made a slow, grieving noise. I missed someone who had been a constant and then wasn't. The numbness would come in waves that felt like they might drown me. And then the lottery happened. I don't mean I scratched a ticket and won $10. I mean the kind of impossible, life-altering win that films rehearse. A jackpot big enough to rewrite budgets, to tilt lives into new geometries. I bought the ticket on a whim, not as a plan for revenge, obviously, but as an exercise in normalcy. I was standing in line at a convenience store that smelled like stale coffee and cold cigarettes, an old song I liked playing softly overhead. I bought a roll of gum, a pack of bread, and a lottery ticket because the cashier handed it to me and I thought, why not? I slept like someone who'd slept their whole life, without the frantic adrenaline that comes from pretending. The morning they announced winners, I thought of the ticket once during coffee, then shrugged it off. I checked the numbers out of a kind of bored curiosity and felt my heart do a synchronized, impossible flip. Then I checked again, louder, as if the numbers had been misprinted. The ticket matched. I matched reality to the receipt in my hand. There are cheap cliches about the way a room seems to go slow around you. I can confirm it's true. The air was thicker, softer, as if sound had been dampened by velvet. I called the lottery office, took the required photos, and tried to be precise when they told me what to do. The world tightened like a fist and then opened into a space that smelled of new paper and possibility. The first and most brutal decision was whether to tell anyone. I called my mother because she is the kind of woman who needs to know things, and she cried on the other end of the line in a way that made me realize how much of my life she had quietly carried. She cried until she laughed. But beyond that, I kept the circle small. My lawyer advised me on the financial logistics, lump sum versus annuity, tax implications, legal protections. It's a strange thing to have legal counsel that feels inadequate to hold the scale of what's happening. Money shaking loose like a volcano of possibility. I told Olivia, and she reminded me that I needed to protect the winnings from predatory claims, from families who might suddenly remember they were owed something. Her pragmatic, dry-voiced calm became another kind of anchor. She recommended trusts, a vault of lawyers, the usual fortress. News spreads in small towns even without social media. Someone at work saw me walking out of a bank with a box that looked too big for an ordinary withdrawal and put two and two together. Within days, an old classmate messaged me with something like restrained joy and the question you never know how to answer. So, what now? I didn't know. I still don't entirely. There's a surreal quality to having so many blueprints suddenly available to you. You can buy homes, travel, forgive debts, set up foundations, and also, you can never get back the years you lost. And then she called. She called at 2:03 p.m. on a Wednesday. The number was familiar but strained. The kind of voice that tries not to sound like it's been rehearsed. She asked how I was. I could hear the background. An office with tired fluorescent lights, the low hum of someone else's life. Her voice sounded smaller in the bones than it ever had. I could have feigned indifference. I could have hung up and bought a pair of shoes and hidden the breath of triumph. Instead, I listened. She told me that the man she'd been seeing had moved away. "I'm sorry," she said, in a voice like paper. "I'm so sorry about everything. I didn't think. I never wanted to hurt you like this." I don't know what I wanted her to say. Maybe I wanted anger, or an apology complicated enough to convince me I mattered. Maybe I wanted nothing at all. I told her, "I'm doing okay," which was true in its own guarded way. Then she asked, almost as a reflex, "Did you get anything?" She was fishing for the smallest moral supremacy, the knowledge that, at least, she hadn't wasted the years. I answered honestly, "I have some money. It's been an odd few weeks." "I hope you're happy," she said. Whatever was behind that, guilt, provocation, genuine hope, I couldn't tell. I felt something like pity for her. Not for the woman who had betrayed me, but for the girl who had been frightened enough to gamble on someone else's arms instead of repairing what she had. In the months after the call, she oscillated between wanting sympathy and defending her choices. She dated, moved apartments twice, and found work that paid the bills but not the mortgage. She tried, in a way, to pick the pieces up and make them look like a life. And me? Money didn't fix every damn thing. It didn't make the nights less hollow or the stupid little habits. The spoon shaped like a question mark on the third shelf I had used for years, less vivid. It didn't take back the small betrayals that had stacked into a ruin. But it did give me agency. I bought my mother a small house that fit her bones. Not the hulking thing we had pretended to need. I set money aside for therapy, because I realized I was carrying too much of an old man's silence in me. I invested in a business that made sense for me, something that felt like legacy rather than vanity. I found ways to make the money quieter, to use it as a tool rather than a trophy. People ask if winning the lottery changed me. Maybe it did. If you're asking whether I used the money as revenge, to rub salt in the wounds of my ex-wife, the answer is no. That's petty and small. But did I ever feel the delicious, guilty, private satisfaction of knowing I'd escaped the practical consequences of her betrayal? Yes. When a lawyer asked me to sign notarized forms reaffirming that the house and car were never marital assets. Forms technically redundant but useful for public perception. I signed them with the weight of a man who had anticipated consequences and then been handed a reprieve. Part of me wanted to call her and say, "Remember how I told you I'd prepare for everything? Here's what prudence looks like." But big reveals are quieter than boasts. I didn't send her a check with a smug message. I didn't light any fires. I took the win and turned it into something that might mean more than the fleeting pleasure of rubbing someone's nose in loss. Every so often I imagine a different path. I imagine confronting her earlier and trying to save what was left. Maybe we would have reconciled. Maybe we would have rebuilt something small together. Maybe we would both have left scarred but better for the attempt. The facts remain. She chose something else, and I chose the route that protected me. When people on the internet call me a monster, I hear their judgment as a mirror and see that there are shadows there I don't like. I don't like that I planned how to make sure she got nothing. I don't like that I felt joy, however small, at my good fortune immediately after sinking into the fresh wound of a divorce. But I also know this. I slept without fear of someone selling the house or repossessing the car. I lived in a house that felt mine because the house now legally belonged to someone whose trust one could rely on, my mother. Maybe that's legalism over empathy. Maybe that's the cost of not being broken. Am I the asshole?